There are two scenarios here, as I explained to her early on. The first scenario is the total abolition of death penalty from all the offences that were found in our law at this moment. At this moment, we have 8 laws that say if you commit one of the section, you will be sentenced to death. This is what we call the capital punishment offences. So there are offences under that act that are considered mandatory. That means if you found guilty under that particular act, you will have to be sentenced to death. And the first one, of course, the famous murder, a case under section 302, and the other one is under section 39B. But then the previous government had introduced the 4 conditions to allow the judge to have a discretion. But that discretion, as I explained just now, it can be very restrictive and very difficult for the judge to exercise because it talks about satisfying 4 conditions. The first condition is that there must be no buyer and seller at the times when you were in possession of the drug, right? And then the second condition was that there must be no agent provocateur. And then the other one is that you are just the handler and the transporter. And the fourth condition was where you, during the investigation stage, you had assisted the police to deter a threat activity in Malaysia or elsewhere. That fourth condition is very difficult to satisfy. So with that, when we look back at the Dr. Ganjar case, the Lokman case, Lokman was found guilty by the High Court just, I think, late last year. And then there was then outcry as to why he was sentenced to death and why the government wants to hang this man, because he had produced evidence to say that he used the prohibited drug. In this case, it was cannabis, to cure his patients. And then he also had a lot of patients that came in as witnesses to support what he said. But still, the judge at the end of the day, after finding him guilty, cannot use that 4 conditions to give him that discretion and then to give him the 30 years. The judge sentenced him to death because that 4 conditions cannot be easily satisfied. So with that, we thought that we had to abolish that 4 conditions, and then this is where the conditions, if it is abolished, then the judge will have a discretion whether to sentence that persons to life or to death by hanging. So at this moment, that is the first scenario. The second scenario is where we want to give the judge the power, the discretion in murder cases, whether to sentence that guy to death or not, or 30 years after a full trial. After finding that person guilty, then we give it to the judge to decide. And also for drug trafficking cases, we also want to give that discretion to the judge. That will be the second scenario. Whereas the third scenario will be where the first discretion on murder cases still there, but then on the drug trafficking cases, maybe we said abolish the death penalty completely. So this is still under consideration at this moment, and we have engaged with the various stakeholders. I had met up with the families members of those who had their loved one murdered, while at the same time also had met up with the family members of the death row inmates. So the approaches can be quite different because at one side, those who had their family members murdered, the feeling of pain and suffering are still there, and the anguish, the anxiety, the loss of someone who is so close to you, who can be father, mother, brother and sister, or and then also It can even be the breadwinner of the family, so it can be very painful. And we have to consider all that feeling. But then, of course, the other thing is that we cannot say that the process of convicting a person through the court is 100% guaranteed, you see. Yeah, there can be an error of judgment. So there is a saying to say that it is better you let 100 guilty men, free death rather than sentence one innocent person to death. Because if one innocent person is dead, your conscience will not allow you to live through, because you know that innocent person has been sentenced to death innocently. So that kind of argument is still ongoing at this stage. But of course, there are clear-cut cases where the evidence was very strong, and then that will be a different consideration completely. As I said, that a person once found guilty by the court will have to rot in prison for at least 10 years before execution order be signed by the Agong or by the Tuanku of the respective states. It will take years, and he would suffer, and then he will have nightmare. He would have difficult life inside prison because he had lost all his freedom.